Welcome to another exciting episode of the NIDS View, a weekly show of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we are advancing peace, promoting stability, and helping you to think deterrence. Each week, we discuss and analyze a recent topic and provide insight into how it affects our national deterrence. We hope you enjoy this show.
Welcome back to another episode of the NIDS View. Of course, I am Adam Lowther, as I always am. And this week, I've got two special guests who are joining us. Curtis and Jim had a meeting at our regularly scheduled time. So we all, it was kind of fortuitous because we had a topic that I've got the perfect people to talk about. Of course, I'm talking about Chris Stone and Kerry Kartchner, and we wanted to talk about, and maybe you, the listeners, have been following this, and that, of course, is the Russians, as some call it, the Sputnik. That is this, we don't quite know exactly what it is. Is it a nuclear ASAT? Is it a way to strike, a terrestrial target? We don't really know. Well, who better than talk about that than Chris, who is also the host of Real Space Strategy. And, he's got a strong space background in the Guard. And then, Kerry has been around negotiating arms control treaties for many moons. And, of course, I thought this would be a great chance to talk about, does what the Russians are doing, is it violating the Outer Space Treaty? What is going on there? So because of all that, it's not Curtis, it's not Jim. We'll have them next week. But this week, Chris, Kerry, thanks for joining me. It should be a great topic. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Good to be here. Thanks, Adam.
Okay, so Chris, let me start with you, and then you jump in whenever you want, Kerry, and that's this idea of the Russians have launched this satellite. We don't exactly know what it is, the best of what I know in the unclassed realm. So what do we think they've done, and to what purpose?
Well, there are two systems that sometimes get confused, and so recently they launched what's called a co-orbital anti-satellite satellite system. That means that it could conventionally strike a target, follow up against another target in orbit, and take it out, or something to that effect. The one that you're talking about with the nuke is a test bed that it's been up for a little while now, that is part of the Cosmos series that a lot of people, including members of the Senate Armed Services Committee and Intel committees that have been talking about it in public, is that this could be a nuclear ASAT or perhaps an EMP weapon of some kind, electromagnetic pulse weapon or something. Like you mentioned, it could hit in space, or it could take out things on the ground. It just all depends on what the operational version of this will be, since this has been testing components. And so there are a lot of different things it could be. And like you said, and I'm willing to chat about any and all of them. And I explored one of them on Real Space Strategy this week, which was the electromagnetic pulse option, both from an in-space and a terrestrial. So feel free to ask about that. But that's kind of what we're seeing. The Biden administration, though, I will mention, has been playing it down as not a big deal, that they haven't done anything really yet. We're just looking at things that could be a concern. But I think it was Representative Turner was very adamant that this was a big deal and a problem and something that needed to be addressed. And so I'm glad that we're discussing it today.
Yeah, I mean, we know about it. So let's talk arms control. Is this a violation of the Outer Space Treaty? Does the Outer Space Treaty even matter? Or is it one that is there and we follow it, and the Russians, the Chinese just sort of do what they want when they want? Where are we?
Sure. The short answer is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 would ban a core-orbital weapon of mass destruction. But it doesn't ban a direct ascent weapon. Because the three key words in the Outer Space Treaty are it prohibits placing a WMD in orbit, it prohibits installing a WMD on the surface of the moon, and it prohibits stationing WMD in outer space. So anything that flies over 100 kilometers high is in outer space, and anything that enters orbit and then leaves orbit before completing a full orbit, we don't consider that a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And I think it's interesting that just a few weeks ago, the U.S. and Japan sponsored a motion or a proposal in the United Nations that would have banned what Russia is planning to do, and Russia vetoed it, not surprisingly. But the proposal that the U.S. and Japan had sponsored would have made it prohibited a direct ascent type WMD weapon.
And I'll also just add real quick, with regards to the Russians and their predecessor entity, Soviet Union, there are several people from the military sphere back in the day, like a guy named General Ira Aker, who was a popular World War II general that led the 8th Air Force, first attack into Germany from England. He used to write several op-eds in the early 60s and late 60s about military topics. And he was arguing that the Soviets' fractional orbital bombardment system, even though the fractional orbit means most of an orbit, not quite a full orbit, would be something that is a violation of it. Secretary McNamara pretty much said, no, it's not. It's only a full orbit that matters. But there were several reports that happened later on that supposedly when they deployed these assets, that they were actually a FOBs with an F and a slash. So it could be fractional, it could be orbital, and therefore it really was a system that could have been based there. And so to many people, the Russians have already breached the Outer Space Treaty with their nukes and space-related programs. The point is well taken about the direct ascent, because at the time there were still systems for missile defense and bomber defense that were basically nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missiles, like the Nike Zeus, Nike Hercules, that were even ringed around DC, that would be launched to high altitude, detonate to take out a formation of bombers. So that would make sense to me that would be something else. But yeah, all other space weapons, the co-orbital, non-nuclear, any kind of weapon can be put in space. And yeah, it was interesting that they not only have voted to veto that motion to reaffirm and add to the Outer Space Treaty's provisions, but also they voted against banning the direct ascent kinetic anti-satellite weapons testing and pretty much everything else. So not really surprising, but there you go.
Let me just respond to that, which I think is really useful clarifications. What made the Russian veto surprising and a little bit troubling is that for decades, both Russia and China had proposed a preventing arms race in outer space initiative, the PEROS initiative. Every year they resubmitted that to the UN agenda, and it would have done a lot of what this proposal that Japan and the United States co-sponsored. And now all of a sudden Russia, after decades of supporting that, it vetoes it. So it's a radical change of departure for. So what does that mean? I mean, what are the implications of Russia's vetoing of that? And I think it's clear they're keeping open the option for both a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon that would be nuclear armed or some kind of a co-orbital device, which I don't know if that would be nuclear armed.
But do you think
that's what Russia's preparing to do?
Do you think it's more signaling to the United States? Because historically, the Russians sign treaties and then violate those treaties. I mean, they don't exactly have a stunning track record of following the treaty. So if it wasn't a specific effort to signal the United States, because of Ukraine and, everything that's going on, why not just sign it and then violate it when it suits them?
So let me connect the Russian program for a direct ascent or co-orbital anti-satellite weapon that possibly involves a nuclear warhead. This veto and and the preparations that are being conducted at Russia's nuclear test site. Because it is clear that Russia is preparing to resume nuclear testing. It is clear that China is making some really remarkable changes to their test site. And it's clear that both of those countries are preparing to resume testing. Now, I don't know if those countries would resume testing on their own initiative, or if they're just preparing for some provocation to justify resuming nuclear testing. But the way I would hypothetically tie all of these things together is if Russia needed a new type of nuclear warhead for its ASAT program. And the type of warhead that it might be looking for such a program, for such an objective, is a nuclear weapon that emits a great deal of energy, like a directed energy weapon, or a neutron bomb that would take out swarms of satellites like Starlink. I think what Russia is preparing to do is an anti-Starlink satellite network capability. And I think that ties all of this together.
Well, and I think if you charge the Van Allen radiation belt, which surrounds the Earth within the lower orbital regions, including medium Earth orbit, you're dealing with not only Starlink, but you're dealing with missile warning and tracking, you're dealing with GPS, and you're dealing with some low-flying weather satellites and even some ISR-related assets, some spy satellite activities that we can use for reconnaissance to try to prevent surprise attacks in the first place. So personally, I think with the treaties, Adam, I think that what they've been doing over the years is more of a lawfare approach to try to make the United States look like the aggressor, while they were basically just biding their time to do whatever they were going to do anyway. Because as you mentioned, even going back to the Hague Convention in the 1890s, the Russians hosted that. And a lot of historians looking back on that are thinking, well, the Tsarist Russians at the time were having problems internally. They had just spent a ton of money expanding their biggest investment for their military, which was their nationwide rail yards, which was kind of big for rapid mobilization of industrialized armies. And now they don't have the money to deal with submarines, chemical weapons, airplanes, all these things. So let's ban them. It makes us look like peace lovers, and it keeps us from having to spend the money, or at least gives us time to figure it out while the West stops it. So, and as you said, you go through there are lots of books that go through that. So I think it was more of a lawfare approach. And now that we're now saying, hey, let's do this, and they're like, no, I don't think so. So I think they'll do what they want regardless of what was proposed.
I might just add one additional point to that. That is a really good historical context that Chris has provided. Russia, I think you are correct, Adam. Russia doesn't have a problem violating anything that it's signed. It just doesn't have that norm of complying with treaties. But it doesn't withdraw from treaties until the U.S. does.
Yeah.
Then it withdraws. So if you look back on our withdrawal from the ABM treaty, then our withdrawal from the INF treaty, those things all provoked Russian tit for tat retaliation by withdrawing from things. So I think Chris is right. This is a lawfare thing, but I think there's also a strategic mission that is driving their vetoing this UN motion and preparing their test site.
So do you think, and this is the one that, sort of I wonder about in terms of, I think I read an article here this week that said that there's about 8,000 satellites, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, and something akin to 5,000 of the 8,000 are American owned. And so I wonder, is this one of those, we'll commit suicide in space, but it'll hurt the Americans more than it hurts us. Is that Russian thinking, or do they have something far more devious planned? Or, because if they do this, and, it's not like you can't sort of you can micro target an ASAT to some degree, particularly if you snuggle up to an ASAT and grapple it, or do one of these other things that we've seen the Chinese thinking about. But if you detonate a nuke in space, for example, we don't really fundamentally understand exactly how that propagates. We don't know directionally exactly, and how does it dissipate, and there's a lot of unknowns that could cause significant, attrition of their own satellites or those of others.
Well, I personally think that we do have a general idea of how a detonation would behave in orbit based on our own testing and experiences back in the Cold War, such as Starfish Prime. The difference between Starfish Prime was back then there was like 25 satellites in space, and now, like you said, there are 8,000, and there are a majority of them because of the proliferated 100 satellites per constellations like Starlink and Kuiper and the Space Development Agency's, Space Transport Layer and their missile warning and tracking. Because for whatever reason, the idea was going back about 10 or 15 years is, hey, rather than having 3 or 4 big satellites like we have with SIBRs and other missile warning and other things like that, let's make it to where it complicates their targeting calculus by having dozens, if not hundreds, of satellites. But we put them in low Earth orbit where anybody with a rudimentary missile capability and a nuclear weapon could go up there and destroy it. And the reason why they're doing this is somewhat, I think, is because they're taking a lead from the page of the Chinese. And the Chinese have been writing specifically about Starlink and Kuiper and other related constellations that have military utility, is that we're not going to look at them as individual satellite targets. We have a multi-layered attack architecture. We have the ability to do everything from reversible jamming and lasing up to nuclear detonation. So we have those options for vertical escalation. However, because of the Americans pushing all their eggs in these one little resiliency modeled baskets, which really aren't that resilient, instead of looking at it from individual satellites, we're saying we're going to do what's called system destruction, and we're going to do everything we can to hit it from various angles all at once. Or worst case, we'll just detonate, and if we detonate it in a certain location and a certain altitude, it would only impact certain things above and below a certain altitude. If it's below a certain altitude in low Earth orbit, for example, like 100 kilometers or a little bit less, then you're going to be dealing with not only impacts into space, but terrestrial impacts. And so, like the electromagnetic pulse piece, whether it's a small yield or a higher yield, you're still going to have potential impacts on critical infrastructure and things of that sort. And one of the things I mentioned in the podcast on Real Space Strategy was EMP Commission and other studies that showed that even if it's just an orbiting satellite flying really low on a north to south trajectory, like you would see from a high north to south Russian or North Korean type of launch scenario, that if it detonates over Chicago, you have the potential to lose 75% of the electric grid in the continental United States, potentially even impacting some parts of Canada and Mexico too, depending on the yield. So there's a lot of things they could do from a deterrent standpoint of psychologically saying we're holding you hostage, sort of a sword of Damocles kind of thing, like, hey, if you interfere more in Ukraine, we're going to detonate this, or hey, if you hurt our efforts with Taiwan or the South China Sea or whatever with Belt and Road, then do you really? It's like I think it was a Chinese general back in the late '90s said, I don't think the Americans are willing to trade LA for Taipei or something to that effect. So I think that's kind of what they're looking at right now. And I also just, for everyone, in my opinion, I take everything that they say at face value. I'm not one of those that just says, oh, they're just bluffing or, oh, they're just rattling their sabers. Because, again, historical precedence shows from other bad guys of the past, when we've ignored it, it ends up becoming a thing because we decided to just go, oh, he's just kidding. So that's what you're getting at. And whether it hurts us more than others, I think it'll hurt everybody. It'll hurt our European allies. It'll hurt our Asian allies. It'll hurt a lot of things because we share a lot of these satellite networks with other people, and they're linked to a lot of critical infrastructure. And one last point with China in particular, if Russia detonates a nuke, it's going to hurt their Beidou system, which is a critical link and a requirement for any of their Belt and Road Initiative projects across the entire globe. So that'll hurt their power projection and influence too. And since they have this special partnership now, I think that would be something that probably Putin, even though he doesn't want to seem like a guy that would want to ask Mother May I to Beijing, I don't think Beijing would be very happy with them if they were
Yeah.
just to go ahead and do something like that. But that's just some answers to your questions.
Yeah, fair point, Kerry.
I think it's important to take a look at the record. I want to kind of circle back to the idea of whether Putin is bluffing or not, because I think he is bluffing on some of his nuclear threats. But in 2007, China conducted an ASAT test, which they didn't announce to anybody. They didn't say anything about it. And several weeks after the test, the Chinese foreign ministry issued a statement about it, which was kind of apologetic. I remember being in the government at that time, and we were wondering why it took so long for the Chinese to say anything about this test, because it was super destructive. They destroyed one of their own derelict satellites above a 600-kilometer altitude, and it now constitutes maybe half to two-thirds of the debris. And Chris could confirm this, that most of the debris in orbit now is from that 2007 satellite test, our ASAT test. We figured the reason the foreign ministry didn't speak up about it right away is because they didn't know about it. We think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was taken by surprise by something that the Defense Ministry had done. And there was an international outcry against that. But 6 years later, China did a nearly identical test in 2013, only this time they called it a ground-based mid-course intercept test, which was interesting because that's what the U.S. was doing. And so they just called it what the U.S. was doing. And that time they didn't get the international outcry, but they also avoided creating much more debris. And then you've got Russia testing in November 2021 with a direct ascent thing, also creating enormous amounts of debris. So you've got these countries that are damaging access to space with those kinds of activities. And so I think we've got to take it seriously when they start talking about programs like this.
Yeah, and one point about the 2021 Russian ASAT test, you didn't have a apologetic tone coming out of the Russian foreign ministry. Instead, you had quotes coming out like it was executed like a fine, precise watch and things of that sort. So you have a different perspective there. Obviously, Putin is the man. Of course, Xi Jinping is the man too. But at the same time, it was more of a new thing. And then one other thing, they also tested one that went out into GEO, which is about 22,000 miles, which demonstrated that the Chinese, at least, and the Russians were trying to get back into this world too, but the Chinese demonstrated at least that they have the ability to hold at risk all American and allied satellite targets, whether it's depending on what the mission is. So it doesn't really matter. There's no Cold War type trip line for hitting a missile warning asset because of our use of them for more tactical operations such as Desert Storm and Forward. And so there's that whole idea like, well, we'll just nuke them if they hit one. Like, we haven't shown any willingness to do that. So our deterrent posture has been weakened in that respect because of we just assumed that that was all in the past. And now we're having to go, oh, here we go. We're back to this again. So it's going to take some time, I think, for people in government and out of government to fully come to realize that, as Dr. Kartchner, I think you mentioned in one of your books, that the utility of the nuclear weapon has grown. It has not shrunk. And even with space, it's inconceivable, it's unlikely, it's unthinkable. But those are the very things that we need to be thinking about and preparing for if we want to make sure that everything stays as safe and secure as possible.
What was that character's name in The Princess Bride? Inconceivable. Was that Fezzik?
Yeah. The Sicilian.
And then he loses the vet and dies, and because he couldn't conceive of what she had done or what the other guy had done. So,
yep.
So let me ask then, if you were a betting man and you were placing bets in Vegas, on the willingness of the Russians or the Chinese to essentially employ, let's say, a nuke versus, some other form, a nuke in space for ASAT purposes. What would you be willing to bet on that? Is it a 50-50 chance that they'll, let's suppose a conflict does occur, or either between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, or, the U.S. NATO begins heavily supporting Ukraine. It sort of turns the tide and the Russians are facing imminent defeat. Do you think something like that is high probability, low probability? The Russians and the Chinese are like, man, this would be a really serious move. We better hold off. How do you see it playing out?
So from the Chinese perspective, I'll do the Chinese first. The Chinese perspective, they have written in their legit documents that they want to have the multi-layered approach. They want to have escalation dominance. They have an attack to deter mindset. And because of that attack to deter mindset, they want to have options. And so whatever the most psychologically astute and useful tool in the minds of their adversary is what they would probably be willing to use, because they want to win without fighting. It's a psychological piece. Is deterrence is more than just the weapons piece. And so because of our lack of forward leaning on this for several decades, trying to take the high road and not actually preparing for things, I would say they would have a good shot at using one if they thought they needed to. I think they would start lower or do a multiple things, or they could use all of them at the same time or one at a time and escalate up. But they want to have the options to do any or all the above. On the Russian side, they have an escalate to de-escalate mentality in most cases. I'm kind of surprised they haven't used any of their tactical nukes with all their threats. I thought I was a little surprised that they hadn't used it yet. But I think that, Putin's even starting to see that he can only threaten so long before the psychological impact wears off. And in some cases, I think it backfired on him with adding additional NATO allies that he had threatened before. Like, if you join NATO, we'll nuke you. Okay, we'll join NATO. No nuking. So my guess is that the Russians would be willing to do whatever they think, but my guess is they would start at a lower threshold and work their way up. But as I said earlier, I don't think I would bet against them, either of them. I think if they're building them to use them. I don't think they build them just to say, look what we have. I think they build them for use, and if they needed to and they think they needed to, they would use them.
I think they haven't used them because they don't work.
Really?
They won't work. Okay, so I've had the opportunity to...
Tell me more.
I've had the opportunity to go on several inspections into Russian nuclear weapon bases. And what I found is that those bases were derelicts. They were in deep disrepair until you got to the section of the base that dealt with strategic nuclear weapons. Then everything was brand new, everything was state of the art, and so it was clear where the money went. But I think that also carries over to the tactical. I think the tactical nuclear weapons in Russia have been neglected. They haven't been modernized, they haven't been exercised. I think the men are scared to use them. The soldiers are scared to use them. I think if Russian authorities gave an order to use them, they wouldn't do it, because they're not sure they're going to work. They're not sure how they're going to do it. But I think they're also deterred a little bit by NATO's position, which I'm really pleased that NATO has taken a pretty firm stand that any use of a nuclear weapon would erase all the restraints. And NATO has been doing these exercises that are highly classified, but they've leaked out, what the essence of them are. And the exercises are massive conventional retaliation against Russian forces in Ukraine and Russian forces supporting Ukraine with massive NATO conventional response. I think that is very intimidating to the Russians. So I think there's several reasons why they haven't used them and why I think Putin's bluffing at a certain level, which is the tactical weapons and their delivery vehicles are in poor state of repair. And the soldiers are likely to rebel against using them. And any crossing of the nuclear threshold like that is going to provoke a broader war with NATO that is, 32 countries against Russia. And the odds are, anyways, we could get into all that. But so I think, however, coming back to the space issue and my reading of Russian strategic culture and my reading of Russian nuclear doctrine is that they would seek to lash out and blind the enemy at the outset of a conflict.
Yeah.
Not waiting until they were in desperate straits, but as one of their very first moves. I'm less sure about that with the Chinese, and I defer to Chris on his interpretation of Chinese doctrine. But the Russian one is, strike first and blind the enemy. And so that's why I'm concerned with what Russia's reportedly doing with respect to various ASAT programs.
And they're also supposed to be bringing back their FOBs too, I heard. So
What is that?
I heard a rumor about that one of their ICBMs also has the ability to be extended range. So yeah, we'll see if that works, because they have had some issues, like Dr. Kartchner mentioned. I think was it Bulava, their sub launched that failed twice with Putin there visiting with his nice Navy outfit on. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure, but their ASATs have done decent. They have a pretty robust space program, and it seems like the most money they put into their forces goes into their rocket force and their aerospace.
Exactly.
That seems to be the two popular services.
Yeah. Well, it's a question that we are not going to solve today, and unfortunately, we are out of time for this podcast. So, I think you made a few great points. Kerry, you sort of threw one in there at the end with you don't think that they work, and then Chris, you offered us a few earlier on. So it's been a good discussion. So, gents, thanks for coming on today and talking about this important topic. It's great
problem.
to have you. Well, so unfortunately we're at the end, but I want to thank Chris and Kerry, and of course I always want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode of the NIDS View. And of course, as always, we want to remind you to think deterrence.
Thank you for listening to the NIDS View. This show is produced under the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a 501c3 organization dependent upon donations to provide this podcast and bring about awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength and our national deterrence. You can catch all of our podcasts or provide feedback at thinkdeterrence.com. I would like to thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, our sponsors, and all the fantastic members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible. Stay tuned next week for another exciting and informative The NIDS View.